We'll continue our discussion of microbial life by turning to look at eukaryotes. Not all eukaryotes are microbes. In other words, some of our eukaryotes are much larger. These are our multicellular organisms that we are more familiar with, animals, plants, and to some extent fungi. But we are going to start by looking at the microbial eukaryotes, our protists, which fall into 7 major groups. And out of 3 of those groups, actually out of 2 of them, out of 2 of those groups, we get our plant kingdom and then our animal and our fungi kingdom. And each one of those groups are more closely related to other protists than they are to each other. So we're going to spend some time talking about the different supergroups that we find in our protists. But before we do that, let's look at where we are in our evolutionary history. So eukaryotic cells arose about 1.8 billion years ago. So that is right here on our evolutionary timescale. First prokaryotic cells appear sometime between 3.8 and 3.5 billion years ago, with our first positively identified fossils appearing at about 3.5 billion years in the fossil record. Shortly in evolutionary time, shortly after the appearance of our eukaryotic cells, we see multicellular organisms in the fossil record. So about 1.5 billion years ago, we start to see groups of specialized cells that we would consider multicellular organisms instead of just a colony of individual organisms that appear to be in a multicellular cluster. So about 1.5 billion years ago, we start to get true signs of multicellularity, where we get differentiation and dependence of one cell on the overall organism. So we're going to talk about some of the groups that fall into this eukaryotic category. And those organisms are very loosely classified as our protists. Now, protist is a name that biologists use for quite a long time to describe our eukaryotic single-celled organisms, and all protists are eukaryotes. Now, most of our eukaryotes, at least our eukaryotic groups, are going to be the single-celled protists. But out of those single-celled eukaryotic protists, we are going to see our multicellular organisms. And the multicellularity is going to actually evolve 3 times within this group. So protists are the eukaryotic organisms that don't neatly fit into the fungi, plantae, or animalia kingdoms. We are going to see some different organization. We're going to see some different types of organisms that appear to be fungi-like, plant-like, and animal-like, but they are not part of any of those groups. Some of them might be closely related, some of them may not. Generally, we're going to find our protists in moist habitats, and this makes sense because they would have evolved at a time when life was still living in oceans, living in aquatic environments. And so most of these single-celled organisms don't have the structures to help them live well on land without some sort of protection from the elements. So our eukaryotic cells don't have a cell wall except for our plants, and most of them have to maintain their environment in a watery location. Most of our protists are going to be microscopic, but some are going to be a little bit bigger. In fact, some of them are going to be really big. So, for example, seaweed or kelp, which we would technically call a brown algae, can be rather large. You can have kelp forests that are several meters or even 100 meters tall, anchored to the seafloor, and then stretching all the way up through the water column up to where they get the most sunshine. So they can be rather large. And then our red and green algae, sometimes we see very large red or green algae. We can sometimes also see large fungi that are macroscopic as well. Most of our groups, though, that we're going to see are going to be single-celled, small organisms. So just a quick review of eukaryotic cells compared to prokaryotic cells. All prokaryotic cells are going to have a cell wall and a cell membrane on the inside. We may have some additional external features as well, but we definitely have to have that plasma membrane and that cell wall around the outside. In a prokaryotic cell, there are no organelles. Sorry, the name escaped me for just a minute. There are no organelles, but DNA is contained in a region called the nucleoid. So it doesn't have a specific nucleus like our eukaryotic cells, but it does have a nucleoid region where the DNA is generally contained. Our eukaryotic cells are going to be defined by having a nucleus and those membrane organelles, membrane-bound organelles. They're going to have much more complex structure because of those organelles, and they're going to require some organization within the cell. They also have a cytoskeleton, which is basically an internal scaffolding that's going to provide internal shape and support for the external structure of that cell. But one of the unique properties about eukaryotes is that because many of them don't have a cell wall, they are able to change shape. So this is going to some extent, especially in our protists, allow for movement. But it's also going to allow organisms to better adapt to their environment. What that means is they can take a variety of different forms. So our plant cells are generally going to be kind of cube-shaped, maybe not exactly, but roughly cube-shaped. Our bacteria are going to all have specific structures. They're going to be cocci, or they're going to be bacilli, or whatever their shape is, and it's not going to change very much because it has that rigid cell wall. But our eukaryotic cells without the cell wall are going to be able to take a variety of different forms. It may or may not be asymmetric or symmetrical. And then finally, as part of a multicellular organism, eukaryotes have to have proteins that are going to help adhere them to other cells. So they are going to essentially be stuck to the other cells in a multicellular organism. So because protists are a mess as far as taxonomic classification, we have a lot of old phrases that we use. Originally, all of the single-cell protists were lumped into one group, whether or not they were plant or animal-like, under the assumption that all of the multicellular organisms must have been from a single common ancestor and therefore more closely related to each other. Turns out, based on molecular evidence and a better understanding of some of these groups, that multicellularity is not the common, or was not in the common ancestor of those three groups. And in fact, we have protists and, say, plants that are closely related to one another because they share a common ancestor, such as a common ancestor that has chloroplasts. Same goes for fungi. They have closer common ancestors that are the fungi-like organisms, and they're more closely related to those, than they are to animals. So there are three major, it says groups here, it really should be descriptions of the ecological role of these protists. So we have some, they are algae. They are generally going to be the ones that are performing photosynthesis. So these are going to be our plant-like protists. We've got protozoa. Zoa means animal. Proto means before or early, like a prototype is the early version of, say, a machine or something like that. So a protozoa is an early animal. They are going to be heterotrophs because all animals are heterotrophs. And then we have fungi-like protists, which are organisms that have a metabolism and nutrition style similar to fungi. But these are just categories that we use to describe basically their position in the trophic levels of life. So they are not based on taxonomy, they are not based on common ancestry, they're just a description of their characteristics. Again, we have some informal labels for our protists. that are based on motility or their ability to move. And we're going to find these characteristics in several different protist groups as we talk a little bit more about them. Some of them are flagellates, which means they move by flagellum, that they move in a whip-like pattern and causes them to propel forward. And some of them are ciliates. Ciliates have small structures along their body that basically look like little tiny hairs, and they move by beating, kind of like the beating of an oar. They all kind of move simultaneously. If you Google a video of this, just cilia movement on a protist or on a protozoan, you'll see they kind of move in waves. And what they're doing is causing liquids to flow across the cell. Cilia can also be used for movement in their environment. Another way that some of our protists move are by a structure called a pseudopodia. A pseudopod is a leg-like structure, so pod means leg or foot, pseudo means fake. Basically what happens is that one of these pseudopods stretches out from the organism and then basically kind of pulls everything behind. So what's actually happening is that cytoplasm is extended into these pseudopod lobes, pushed out in the direction that the organism wants to go. And then cytoplasm from other regions sort of flows through to that pseudopod and everything moves in that direction. So basically kind of creeps or crawls along, kind of oozes along, if you will, as that cytoplasm sort of propels it forward by the use of that pseudopod. We can also describe our protist groups by the habitat that they occupy. So all of our pictures here are of photosynthetic organisms, but they don't necessarily have to be photosynthetic. For example, plankton is any protist that is swimming or floating in the water column. So this could be a non-photosynthetic organism. It could be a photosynthetic organism. And they are not attached to anything in their environment. We've got an example up at the top of a red tide. We'll talk about this later in the protist lecture, what a red tide is and what organism causes it. But you can see that floating there in that water. Phytoplankton is a plankton that is photosynthetic. So this red organism here is actually a red photosynthetic pigment. You can also have the green ones like you would normal plants or algae. Periphyton are attached to surfaces underwater. So this is usually what I would think of when I think of algae in a natural body of water. So near the shore in really shallow waters, you can get this sort of mat or carpet of periphyton, usually algae. And then we've got the really large organisms, the macroalgae, like our kelp that we mentioned earlier. And this is generally called seaweed. Sea because it's growing in the water, weed because it's growing out of the substrate at the bottom of the water.